The auctioneer's voice carried across the frozen barnyard like something final. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the liquidation sale of the Brant Farm operation. 640 acres, Faribault County, Minnesota. Equipment begins at 9 o'clock sharp. Livestock at 11. Land parcels at 2 this afternoon. Everett Brant stood 30 feet back from the crowd, arms crossed tight against his chest like a man trying to hold his own ribs in place. He was 51 years old, and he had not slept in 4 days. His face was the color of the March sky gray, flat, empty of warmth. He did not move when the auctioneer spoke. He did not shift his weight or look around. He simply stood there, absorbing the words the way cold ground absorbs rain, slowly, without giving anything back. Norma was not there. She could not be. 3 days earlier, Everett had driven her and the kids to her sister's place in Mankato without saying much on the way. Norma had not asked him to explain. She had packed 2 suitcases and a box of photographs, and she had kissed him at the door of her sister's house and held his face in both hands for a long moment without speaking. Then she had gone inside. Everett had sat in the truck in that driveway for several minutes before he could make himself drive away. She could not watch strangers pick through 23 years of their life. Neither of them had said that out loud. They did not need to. The crowd numbered close to 200 people. Some were neighbors' men. Everett had borrowed equipment from shared fence lines with passed on the road for 2 decades. Some were equipment dealers who had driven up from Sioux Falls or down from the Twin Cities, men with clipboards and sharp eyes who made their living buying at liquidation prices and selling at market rates. They were not cruel men. They were simply businessmen operating in a system that had created an opportunity, and they intended to take it. And some Everett knew exactly who they were. 3 men in clean coats standing together near the barn door, speaking quietly, holding coffee cups they had brought in a thermos. They represented First Consolidated Bank of Blue Earth, the bank that had called his operating loan in November, the bank that had rejected every restructuring proposal his attorney had submitted over 4 months. The bank that had looked at his records, his history, his 23 years of continuous operation on this ground, and had decided that none of it was sufficient reason to give him more time. They were not there to recover a debt. Everett understood that now, though it had taken him several months to understand it fully, they were there to acquire an asset. The debt was the mechanism. The farm was the goal. They would take it at auction, carry it on their books for 6 months, and sell it to an investor or a corporate operation when prices recovered. And prices would recover. They always did. The bank would not lose money on this transaction. Only Everett would lose. He knew all of this, and he stood there anyway because it was his land until the hammer fell, and he was not going to be somewhere else when it happened. Standing almost hidden behind a grain truck at the far corner of the property was a man nobody was paying attention to. Clem Vosberg, 42 years old. He farmed 800 acres about 6 miles to the northland. His family had worked since his grandfather broke it from prairie in the 1920s. He had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas work coat, his John Deere cap pulled low over his forehead. He was watching the crowd the way a man watches weather coming across flat land, patiently, carefully reading what was building. Nobody was looking at Clem Vosberg. That was about to change. But before any of that happened, before the hammer fell on a single lot, before the day became the thing it was going to become, you need to understand how a man like Everett Brant ended up standing in his own barnyard watching strangers catalog everything he owned. Because Everett Brant was not a careless man. He was not a gambler or a dreamer or a fool. He was a farmer who had done exactly what the people who were supposed to know told him to do. In 1979, the county extension agent had come out to the Brant operation and sat at Norma's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of charts. Land values in prime Minnesota agricultural counties had been climbing for a decade. Export demand for American grain was at historic highs. The Soviet Union was buying. The world was buying. The agent pointed to the charts and said that a man in Everett's position, solid ground, proven operation, good standing with his lender, was leaving money on the table if he did not expand. 2 weeks later, an agricultural economist from the University of Minnesota Extension Office came to the same kitchen table with a different folder and the same conclusion. The numbers pointed one direction. Growth. The loan officer at First Consolidated Bank of Blue Earth, a man named Philip Garrett, who wore a bolo tie and shook hands with both hands, had been the most enthusiastic of all. He had pulled up Everett's account history and tapped the paper with one finger and said, Everett, you are exactly the kind of borrower we want to grow with. You are leaving equity idle. Let us put that equity to work. So Everett bought at the quarter section to the south 160 acres of Class A soil that had been farmed by the Hendrickson family since 1952 and had come available when old Warren Hendrickson's sons decided they wanted to go to college instead of farming. He paid $200 per acre. He borrowed the money from First Consolidated Bank of Blue Earth. He upgraded his primary tractor to a John Deere 440 bought new, 1979, $38,000. He expanded the hog operation. He did everything the experts had said to do. Then the world changed. In 1980, President Carter placed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union following the invasion of Afghanistan. Export markets that had driven American commodity prices for a decade dried up almost overnight. Grain prices fell. Then interest rates, which the Federal Reserve was pushing aggressively to fight inflation, hit 21%. The operating loan Everett had carried comfortably at 9% became something else entirely at 21. The land he had bought at $2,100 per acre began to lose value as farms across the Midwest went under and flooded the market with distressed properties. By 1983, comparable ground in Faribault County was selling for less than $900 per acre. The experts had not mentioned this possibility. Not one of them, not the extension agent, not the university economist, not Philip Garrett with his bolo tie and his two-handed handshake, had included the scenario where everything went wrong simultaneously. Everett spent 3 years adjusting, cutting costs, diversifying, doing the things a farmer does when conditions turn. He was methodical, and he was serious, and he was not inclined to panic. He believed that if you worked hard and managed carefully, the situation would stabilize. He believed this the way a man believes something he has tested and found true over and over again across a lifetime. Hard work and careful management had always been enough before. They were not enough this time. In November of 1984, First Consolidated Bank of Blue Earth sent a letter informing Everett Brant that his operating loan was being called. The bank required full repayment of the outstanding balance, $340,000, including accumulated interest that had been added to the principal within 90 days. His attorney submitted 4 separate restructuring proposals. The bank declined all 4. The reasons given were technical, buried in loan agreement language, airtight from a legal standpoint, and completely indifferent to the human reality they described. The farm that had been worth $380,000 in 1981 would be lucky to bring $200,000 at auction. Everett owed $340,000. The difference between what the lands would sell for and what he owed was a number his attorney called a deficiency judgment. It meant that even after losing the farm, Everett could be sued for the gap. He could lose the land and still owe the bank money he did not have. He understood this now in March of 1985, standing 30 feet from the crowd in his own barnyard, watching the machinery of a system that had first encouraged him, then extended him, and was now consuming him, operate with perfect indifference. The night before the auction, Everett did not sleep. Norma and the children had been in Mankato for 3 days. The house was empty in a way that felt different from ordinary emptiness, heavier, more specific, the way a room feels after furniture has been moved out and the indentations in the carpet remain. He ate something he did not taste and washed the dish and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the barn. After a while, he put on his coat and went outside. He walked the property in the dark, not because he needed to, not to check anything or repair anything, but because it was his land for one more night, and he wanted to move across it one last time the way a man moves across something that belongs to him. The frozen stubble crunched under his boots. His breath came out white in the air. He walked the south field he had bought from the Hendricksons, the ground that had started this whole sequence of events, and he did not feel anger at it. It was good ground. It had never done anything wrong. It had simply been the instrument of a set of decisions that had not anticipated what came next. He stopped at the cattle barn and stood with his hand on the door for a moment before going in. The smell hit him first, warm hide hay, the particular dense animal smell of wintered cattle. He walked the length of the barn, slowly running his hand along the stall gates. Some of the cows lifted their heads and watched him. A few of them he had pulled as calves in February storms, gotten up at 2 in the morning to go out and work in the cold until a new life was standing on uncertain legs. They knew his voice. They had known it their whole lives. He did not let himself think about the fact that by this time tomorrow, They would know someone else's barn, someone else's voice. Or possibly no voice at all, just the anonymous efficiency of a commercial feedlot where no individual animal was known by anyone. He kept moving. Near the equipment shed, he stopped at the old wooden water trough his father had built in 1961, the year Everett was 17 and learning to drive the original tractor. His youngest boy had sat on the edge of that trough at age 7, watching Everett repair the pump, asking questions the way 7-year-olds ask questions constantly, enthusiastically, without concern for whether the questions were the right ones or made sense. Everett had answered every one of them. He had not been impatient, not once. He had thought at the time that he had his whole life to stand next to a water trough answering his son's questions. He placed his hand on the cold wood of the trough for a moment. Then he went back inside. He did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and looked at the surface of the table which Norma had bought secondhand in 1969 and refinished herself over 3 weekends while Everett was in the field. The table had been in this kitchen since before their first child was born. He thought about the meals that had been eaten at it, the homework done, the arguments that had started and finished, the quiet, ordinary evenings that had seemed unremarkable at the time and now seemed, in retrospect, to have been exactly what a life was supposed to feel like. He sat there until the sky outside began to change. Norma did not sleep either, though she was 45 miles away in Mankato. She sat at her sister's kitchen table, a different table, in a different kitchen, with her own cold cup of coffee and the same blank stare at a surface that told her nothing. She had not cried since the drive down. She would not let herself until this was over, until there was something on the other side of it to cry toward. For now, she simply sat in the dark of her sister's kitchen and held herself very still and waited for a morning she did not want to arrive. She had never blamed Everett. That was the thing people would not have understood if she had tried to explain it, so she had not tried. He had done what responsible men were supposed to do when the people with expertise told them which direction was forward. He had trusted the system. The system had failed him. Blaming Everett for that would have been like blaming the earth for a drought. But she also knew something that she had not said aloud to anyone, including Everett, because saying it would not have changed anything and would only have added weight to what he was already carrying. She knew that the farm, the physical land, in the buildings, in the equipment, and the herd was not the thing she was afraid of losing. Those were things. Things could be replaced or rebuilt or gotten along without. What she was afraid of losing was harder to name. It was the specific texture of a life lived in one place over time, the particular weight of 23 years of mornings and seasons and small, accumulated knowledge of a piece of ground. That was not replaceable. That was not the kind of thing you rebuilt somewhere else. She sat in the dark of her sister's kitchen and waited for morning. 6 miles to the north of the Brandt farm, in a farmhouse that had belonged to the Vosberg family since his grandfather's time, Clem was also awake before dawn. He was standing at the window of the kitchen, looking out at his own fields and drinking coffee that was still hot because he had just made it. He was not anxious. He had been planning this for 4 years. To understand what Clem Vosberg was doing behind that grain truck in the Brandt barnyard, you have to go back further than 1985. You have to go back to a farmhouse in Nicollet County in 1961 when Clem was 17 years old and his father, Peter Vosberg, lost the family farm. Different crisis, same story. Peter had borrowed in the late 1950s when lenders were optimistic and land was appreciating, and the advice from everyone with credentials was to expand. Then a combination of falling commodity prices and rising loan costs had pulled the ground out from under him. The bank had foreclosed in the spring of 1961. Peter Vosberg had packed his family into a truck and driven to Albert Lea, where he spent the next 17 years working on the kill floor of a meatpacking plant. He was not a weak man. He had not been defeated by laziness or poor character or bad luck in the ordinary sense. He had been defeated by a system that had encouraged him to extend himself and then withdrew its support when conditions changed, and the math that remained was not survivable. He understood this, and the understanding did not make it easier. It made it harder because there was no target for the anger. You cannot fight a system. You can only absorb what it does to you. Peter Vosberg died in November of 1978. He was 64 years old. He died in the same rented house in Albert Lea he had moved into in 1961, in a bedroom that looked out at a parking lot, and he died with a bitterness that had never fully left him, a low chronic grief for the life he had planned and the ground he had lost, and the version of himself that had existed before the bank foreclosed. He was not a miserable man. He had loved his wife and his children, and he had done his work faithfully for 17 years. But something in him had never healed from what happened in 1961, and the people who knew him well could see it, though they had learned not to mention it. Clem had stood at his father's grave on a gray November afternoon in 1978 and made a promise out loud with only the wind and his wife Bet as witnesses. He was 35 years old. He said that he would not let what happened to his father happen to anyone else that he could reach. He said it plainly without drama, the way he said most things. Then he went home. Bet had thought it was the kind of thing a man says at his father's grave. She had not understood not yet that he meant it the way a farmer means a plan concretely, specifically with steps. In 1981, while everyone around him was leveraging up, buying new equipment, expanding into whatever acreage came available, riding the wave of optimism that had been building for a decade, Clem sold a quarter section he had purchased in 1976 when prices were still manageable. He sold it at near the peak of the market and paid down his remaining debt to almost nothing. His neighbors thought he was being overly cautious. His lender thought he was leaving opportunity on the table. In 1982, he stopped farming 200 acres of his best ground and rented it to a neighbor for cash rent. He lived on that rent on what the remaining fields produced and on almost nothing beyond that. No new equipment, no restaurant meals, no vacations. He drove a truck that needed a new muffler and kept driving it. Bet repaired clothes instead of replacing them and did not complain, though she asked him once in the winter of 1983 what exactly he was saving for. For when someone needs it, he told her. She had assumed he meant a loan. A neighbor in trouble borrowed money interest-free or low interest, the kind of quiet help that passed between farming families without being talked about much. She thought it was a generous instinct, perhaps slightly impractical, given the scale of what was happening around them, but essentially kind. She did not understand that he was building a fund specifically large enough to outbid a bank at a foreclosure auction. By the winter of 1984, when it became clear that Everett Brandt's situation was not going to be resolved by negotiation, when Clem heard through the network of conversation that moves through a farming community like groundwater, below the surface everywhere at once, that the bank had rejected all 4 restructuring proposals and a sale date had been set, Clem drove to Rochester. He walked into a bank there that knew by his history, knew his record, knew that he had spent 4 years doing the opposite of what every other farmer in the region had done. He sat across from a loan officer and explained what he intended to do. He said he was going to attend the Brandt auction, outbid the bank for the entire property, and sell it back to Everett Brandt at cost with no interest and no fixed repayment schedule. The loan officer looked at him for a long time. Then he approved the loan. Clem walked out of that bank with a commitment for $950,000 and a cashier's check for $340,000 of his own savings. He drove home to Faribault County, and he did not tell anyone what he had done, not even Bet, not completely, not until the morning of the auction, when he put on his canvas coat and his John Deere cap and picked up a white envelope from the kitchen table. Bet looked at the envelope. "Is that what I think it is?" "Probably," Clem said. She handed him his coffee thermos without another word. She had understood by then enough to know that there was no argument she wanted to make. On the morning of March 14, 1985, Clem Vosberg drove 6 miles south on a county road and parked his truck at the edge of the Brandt property. He arrived early. He wanted to see how the bank representatives positioned themselves, who they talked to, how the auctioneer ran the lots. He stood behind a grain truck where nobody would look at him, drank his coffee, and watched. At 9 o'clock, the auctioneer's voice carried across the frozen barnyard. "Lot number 1, John Deere 4440 1979 model, showing 4,200 hours. We'll start the bidding at $12,000. Everett watched the tractor he had bought new for $38,000 begin its journey towards someone else's equipment yard. He did not move. He stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and he watched. Clem watched too from behind the grain truck. He did not bid on anything. Not the tractors, not the planter, not the gravity wagons or the disc or the equipment that had been part of this operation for a decade and a half. He let it all go lot by lot through the morning hours as the temperature stayed in the low 20s and the crowd's breath rose in small white clouds and the auctioneer's voice found its rhythm. and kept going. He was waiting for the land. Around noon during the break before the livestock sale, Everett's brother drove up from Faribault and found him sitting on the tailgate of his pickup, staring at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has been absorbing hits for a long time and is still upright but is running on something other than ordinary energy. "You okay?" his brother asked. Everett thought about the question for a moment. "You know what the worst part is," he said finally. "It's not losing the farm. I mean, it is, but it's not. The worst part is knowing that in 6 months the bank is going to sell this land to some investor from the cities for what it's actually worth. And I won't see $1 of that. They get the land and they get to sue me for the difference." His brother did not have an answer. There was not one. The livestock went at 1 o'clock. The cattle Everett had worked beside for years, the ones that had heard his voice their whole lives, moved through the ring quickly. Dairy prices were holding better than grain, so they brought decent money. But decent money was still strangers loading them into unfamiliar trailers and driving away. A man can lose equipment. Equipment is metal and hydraulics, and it does its job until it wears out. But livestock you have raised from calves, livestock that turns toward you when you come into the barn, that is something else. Everett watched them go and felt something give way inside him that had held until now. At 1:45, the crowd reassembled near the auctioneer's platform at the top of the driveway. The land was next, 640 acres of Class A soil in Faribault County, Minnesota. Tile-drained, productive, less than 2 miles from a paved road. In any normal year, the kind of ground that did not come available often. In 1985, it was the kind of ground that came available every week in Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, all across the agricultural Midwest. Every single week, another farm went under the hammer. The bank representatives moved closer to the platform. They held their coffee cups and spoke quietly and did not look at Everett, who had positioned himself at the edge of the crowd where he could see the auctioneer clearly. Clem Vosberg moved closer too, but he stayed at the edge just beyond the main crowd, still not drawing attention. His hand was in his coat pocket, resting on the sealed white envelope. "All right, folks," the auctioneer said. "We have 4 parcels. The home quarter, 160 acres, including all buildings and the homestead. The north quarter, the south quarter, and the west 80. We'll sell them individually first, then offer them as a combined package. Bidding will open at $1,000 per acre on the home quarter. $1,000 per acre. For land that should have been worth $1,500 minimum in any functional market. Land the bank's own appraiser had valued at $850 per acre for foreclosure purposes, a number that would be used to calculate Everett's credit while the auction started higher, and whatever it brought above that figure went to the bank as recovery costs. Do I hear $1,000 per acre? That's $160,000 for the home quarter with all improvements." A hand went up. A local farmer who had been buying foreclosed land for 2 years, expanding his operation, one distressed sale at a time. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had capital in a market where capital was scarce. 1,000. Do I hear 1,100? One of the bank representatives raised his hand. 1,100 per acre. Do I hear 12? The local farmer shook his head. He understood the signal. When the bank was bidding, you did not fight them. They had resources that made any competition pointless. You waited for the next lot or the one after that, and you let the bank have what the bank wanted. Going once at 1,100 per acre, Clem Vosberg raised his hand. 1,200. Every head in the barnyard turned. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, more like a collective intake of breath. The kind of sound a group makes when something unexpected interrupts a pattern everyone thought was settled. Everett Brandt's eyes went wide. He turned to look at Clem, and for a moment he could not process what he was seeing. Clem Vosberg, 42 years old, 800 acres 6 miles to the north, and a debt load that everyone in the county knew was not small. Clem Vosberg had no business bidding on land in March of 1985. Half the people standing in that barnyard believed Clem would be in Everett's position inside a year. The bank representative's expression shifted from routine confidence to something sharper. He raised his hand. 1,300. Clem did not hesitate. 1,400. Another sound from the crowd. The auctioneer looked between them with the expression of a man who has run hundreds of these sales and is encountering something unfamiliar. 1,500, the bankman said, his voice tighter now. 1,600, Clem said. Someone in the crowd said something under their breath. Heads were turning. People who had been drifting toward their trucks stopped and came back with a 1,700 per acre, the bank representative said. He turned briefly to his colleague, and the look between them was quick and communicative. Something was wrong with this. The pattern had broken down. This was not how these sales proceeded. Clem paused. One beat. Two. And Everett felt his chest compress. He did not know what Clem was doing or why, but he knew that pause meant something and he was not sure what. Then Clem said, $2,000 per acre. The barnyard went silent. $2,000 per acre. That was more than fair market value, more than the peak price of 1981, more than anyone had paid for ground in Faribault County in 4 years. The bank representative's face had gone from pink to red. He turned to his colleagues, and the conversation between them was urgent and brief. One of them looked at a piece of paper, another looked at Clem, then the first man looked at the auctioneer and shook his head, one step back into the crowd and was still. Sold, the auctioneer said. The hammer came down. 160 acres to bidder number 73, Clem Vosberg, at $2,000 per acre. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in confused, overlapping conversation, the sound of 200 people trying simultaneously to understand what had just happened and what it meant. Everett Brandt felt the ground tilt. Clem had just bought his farm. With what money and why, and what did it mean, Everett did not know any of it. He only knew that Clem Vosberg had done something that made no financial sense in the worst agricultural market since the Great Depression, and the bankmen were already walking toward their car, and the auctioneer was calling the next parcel. North Quarter, 160 acres, excellent, tillable ground, some terracing. Will open at $1,000 per acre. Clem raised his hand before the auctioneer could call for an advance. $1,500. The bank representative looked back from halfway to his car. He walked back slowly. His jaw was set. $1,600, he said. $2,000, Clem said. This time the bank representative did not confer with anyone. He turned and walked to his car and got in and pulled the door closed and sat there. His two colleagues exchanged a look and followed him 20 seconds later. The South Quarter sold to bidder 73 at $2,000 per acre. The West 80 sold to bidder 73 at $2,000 per acre, the bank's people having driven off the property entirely by then, their car raising a small trail of dust down the county road. By 3:15 that afternoon, Clem Vosberg owned all 640 acres of the Brandt Farm operation. Total price $1,287,400. The barnyard was quiet in a different way now. Not the ordinary quiet of a sale concluded, but the specific quiet of a crowd doing the same math simultaneously and arriving at the same conclusion. Clem Vosberg had just obligated himself to more than $1 million of debt in an agricultural economy that was destroying farms across the entire Midwest. This was not a heroic act. This was ruin. This was a man watching his neighbor go down and deciding to jump in after him and hoping they both drowned slower than they would have separately. Everett pushed through the crowd toward Clem. His face was doing several things at once, confusion and disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of anger. The anger of a man who has been helped in a way he did not ask for and cannot refuse and does not understand. Clem, he said, what did you just do? You can't afford this. You know you can't afford this. Clem reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the plain white envelope, sealed Everett's name written on the outside in careful block letters. He held it out. Open it when you get home, Clem said. Not here. Then he turned to the auctioneer. I need to settle up. Where do I sign? Everett stood in the barnyard holding the envelope. Around him, the crowd began to drift away, the auction over the shock already turning into the gossip that would travel across Faribault County by dinner and across 3 counties by morning. Most of what people said would be some version of the same thing Clem Vosberg had lost his mind. Everett walked back toward what was still for a few more minutes of paperwork his house. He sat on the front porch step. His hands were not quite steady. He looked at the envelope for a moment, then he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in Clem's careful printing. Not cursive, not hurried, the deliberate print of a man who wanted to be understood exactly. Everett, the farm is still yours. I bought it to keep the bank from getting it. Total cost, including auction fees, $1,287,400. $287,400. I am selling it back to you for exactly what I paid. You can pay me when you can pay me. If that is 5 years from now, that is fine. If it is 10 years, that is fine. If it is never, that is fine too. The bank does not get to win this time. Clem. Everett read it once, then again, then a third time. Then he sat on his own front porch step on his own land, and he cried for the first time since all of this had begun. Not the dry, controlled grief he had been carrying for months, compressed and managed, and kept below the surface where it could not interfere with the work of getting through each day. Real crying, the kind that comes up from somewhere below the chest, the kind a man does alone when there is no longer any reason to hold it back. The farm was his. It was still his. He did not know yet what it would cost him over the next 7 years to make that right with Clem. He did not know about Bet's kitchen that would wait 9 more years for its remodeling, or the truck Clem would drive for a decade past its natural life, or the ground Clem could not buy when it became available, or the equipment he could not replace when it wore out. He did not know any of that yet. He knew only that the envelope was real, and the handwriting was Clem's, and the farm beneath him was still the Brandt farm and would remain so. The March wind moved through the empty barnyard. A door on the equipment shed that had lost its latch last fall swung and banged once in the cold. Somewhere 6 miles north, Clem Vosberg was signing paperwork. And in Mankato, 45 miles south, Norma Brandt sat at her sister's table with a cold cup of coffee and waited for the phone to ring. The phone rang at 7:45 that evening. Norma picked it up on the second ring. She had been sitting at her sister's kitchen table for most of the day, moving only to refill her coffee cup or to answer her children's questions with answers that were honest without being complete. She had not eaten since morning. She did not notice until her sister put a plate in front of her and stood there until she picked up the fork. When the phone rang, she was alone in the kitchen. Her sister had taken the kids to watch television in the other room, an act of careful kindness that Norma had noted and been grateful for without being able to say so. She picked up the receiver. "It's still ours," Everett said. He did not explain further, not on the phone, not that night. He told her he would drive down in the morning and tell her everything in person. She held the phone against her ear after he had finished speaking, long after the line had gone quiet, and she felt something in her chest that she could not have named exactly, not relief, not quite, because she did not yet understand what it meant or at what cost it had come. Something more like the first small loosening of a thing that had been clenched tight for a very long time. She set the phone down. She picked up her fork. She ate. Everett drove to Mankato the next morning and sat at a different kitchen table and read Clem's letter aloud to Norma. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a long moment looking at the piece of paper he had set on the table between them. "We're going to pay him back," she said. It was not a question. "Every dollar," Everett said, "however long it takes." Norma picked up the letter and read it herself slowly, the way she read things that mattered. Then she folded it carefully and handed it back to Everett. "Take the kids home," she said. "It's time to go back to work." That was how it started, not with celebration or relief or the particular lightness a person expects to feel when a terrible thing is avoided. It started the same way the original crisis had started, with two people sitting at a kitchen table, looking at what was in front of them and deciding how to proceed. The drive back to the farm was quiet. The kids sat in the back seat watching the flat landscape move past the windows. The fields on either side of the county road were still frozen, the soil locked under a thin layer of late-season ice that would not break for another month. From the road, the farm looked the same as it always had. The barn, the equipment shed, the line of cottonwoods along the north fence that Everett's father had planted in 1955. The house with its aluminum storm door that had never hung quite straight, the same, all of it. Everett pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running. His son, who was 19 and had spent the drive back from Mankato pretending to sleep in the back seat while actually processing everything he had overheard his parents discussing in the front, leaned forward. "Are we okay, Dad?" Everett turned off the engine. "We're going to be," he said. It was the most accurate answer he had. News of what Clem Vosberg had done at the Brandt auction moved across Faribault County, the way news moves through flatland, fast in all directions, at once reaching places you would not have predicted. By the evening of the auction, it was in 3 townships. By the following morning, it had reached Blue Earth and Winnebago, and a farm outside Truman, where a man named Harlan DeWitt was eating breakfast and listening to his wife Ruth read it to him from a phone message her sister had left. Harlan DeWitt was 53 years old. He farmed 600 acres in Martin County, 12 miles southwest of the Brant property. He was a careful, deliberate man with a dry, methodical way of speaking that tended to mask a strong instinct for how things actually worked. He had made most of the same decisions Everett had made in 1979 and 1980 on the same advice from the same kinds of people with the same results. He was not in foreclosure yet. He was close. He had been negotiating with his own lender for 8 months and making incremental progress that he understood in the part of his mind where honest assessments lived might not be enough. When he heard what Clem had done, he sat with it for 2 days. Then he drove to the Vossberg farm. He was not the first. He was not even the fifth. In the 3 days following the Brant auction, Clem received visitors from 4 counties, farmers who had heard the story and driven out to see if it was true, and if it was true, whether Clem might help them. Clem sat with each of them at his kitchen table. He listened carefully. He asked about their debt structure, their acreage, their timeline. He was honest in return. He did not have unlimited capital. The Rochester Bank had extended him a specific amount, and that amount was now substantially committed to the Brant transaction. He could not do for 8 farms what he had done for 1. Most of the men who came to see him drove home, understanding something they had not fully accepted before that visit, that their situation was not solvable by one neighbor's extraordinary action, that the scale of the crisis exceeded what personal generosity could address, that they were going to have to find their own way through or not get through at all. But 8 of them stayed at the table past the paint where the others left. Clem himself, Harlan DeWitt from Martin County, a man named Arlo Stengel who farmed 400 acres in Blue Earth County and had managed to stay out of foreclosure by selling his equipment fleet and leasing everything back at a loss he could absorb. 4 others from Faribault in the surrounding counties, men who had made different choices at the right moments and had arrived at 1985 with enough capital to act. They were not wealthy men by any meaningful standard. They were farmers who had been careful when careful was unpopular, and that carefulness had left them something to work with. They made an agreement at Clem's kitchen table on a Thursday evening in late March 1985. No written charter, no formal organization, no officers or bylaws or name structure. Only a commitment made by 8 men to each other to show up at foreclosure auctions in the Tri-County area with whatever capital they could bring and bid against the banks. Harlan DeWitt called it the Fair Price Committee. The name stuck, though it was never written down anywhere official. The system they worked out was simple. When a foreclosure auction was scheduled, whoever in the group was closest and had available capital would attend. If the bank's bidding was going to push the price below what the land was worth, and in 1985 it always was, they would bid it up to fair value. When they bought, they offered the same arrangement Clem had offered Everett. Cost price, no interest, repay when you can. It worked 4 times. 4 farming families in a 3-county area kept their land in the spring and summer of 1985 because 8 men had made a promise at a kitchen table and showed up when the hammer fell. 4 sets of children grew up on farms that would have become bank assets. 4 operations continued under the names that had been on the mailboxes for decades. The banks adapted within 6 weeks. The response was efficient and entirely legal. First Consolidated and 2 affiliated lenders in the region shifted to sealed bid sales instead of public auctions. Properties were sold directly to investors before the foreclosure process was fully completed. In 2 cases, sales were structured through intermediaries that made it difficult to identify the buyer at the time of closing. The banks had encountered an obstacle, and they had routed around it the way capital always does when it has the systemic advantage and is willing to be patient. The Fair Price Committee could not bid at a sealed auction. They could not intercept a private sale. The window that had existed for those 6 weeks, the narrow gap between the public auction format and the bank's willingness to engage in one, had closed. 4 farms saved. Then the window closed, and 2 of the 8 men who had stood up to hold it open paid a significant price for having tried. Harlan DeWitt was one of them. He had stretched further than he should have. Not carelessly, Harlan was not a careless man. But the math of carrying another family's land costs while his own operation was already thin had proved over 18 months to be more than his cash flow could sustain. In the fall of 1987, Harlan DeWitt received a letter from his bank that was word for word, structurally identical to the letter Everett Brand had received in November of 1984. His loan was being called. Harlan sat at his own kitchen table with Ruth, who had married him in 1959 and had never once in 28 years suggested he had made a wrong decision even when he had, and they went through the numbers together. The numbers did not leave room for interpretation. He was going to lose the farm. He called Clem on a Tuesday evening. "I know what it sounds like," Harlan said. "I know you already did this once. I know what it cost you." Clem was quiet for a moment. In the background of the call, Harlan could hear the particular ambient sound of a farmhouse at night, the refrigerator cycling a door somewhere settling in its frame. "What's the auction date?" Clem asked. "Third week of November." "I'll be there," Clem said. He did not tell Bet until the morning of the auction, when he put on his coat and picked up his keys, and she looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been married to a man long enough to read him without his cooperation. "Is it the DeWitt place?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she handed him his thermos and turned back to the stove. What neither Bet nor anyone else knew, not Everett, not any of the men who had sat at the Fair Price Committee table, not a single person in Faribault County or Martin County or anywhere else, was that Clem had already decided what he would do if Harlan called. He had decided it in the same quiet internal way he decided most things, not in a moment of drama or resolution, but gradually over time as the possibility took shape and became inevitable in his mind. He had watched Harlan overextend himself, trying to help others, and he had known, without needing it, confirmed that the overextension would eventually come due. And he had been ready. He drove to Martin County alone on a gray November morning. He attended the auction the same way he had attended the Brand auction, standing back watching, waiting for the land. The equipment went the same way equipment always went in those years, at fractions of its worth to dealers who would mark it up and sell it before the month was out. The livestock went quickly. Then the land parcels came up, and the bank's representative raised his hand with the confidence of a man who understood that the outcome was already arranged. Clem Vosberg raised his hand too. The pattern repeated itself. The bidding climbed. The bank blinked first. The hammer fell. Harlan DeWitt received a white envelope with his name written on the outside in careful block letters. He read it on his front porch step and recognized every word of it because he had heard Everett describe it word by word more than once in the 2 years since the Brand auction. He sat with it for a long time before he went inside. Arlo Stengel, the second member of the committee to lose his own ground, navigated his collapse differently. When his bank moved against him in late 1986, the sealed bid format that had killed the committee's effectiveness was already in place. There was no public auction for Clem to attend. Arlo's farm was sold directly to an investment group from the Twin Cities before the foreclosure was even finalized. He went to work at a grain elevator cooperative in Blue Earth, lived carefully, and in 1988, when land prices had fallen further, and a 40-acre parcel came available at a price that made arithmetic sense, he bought it back. A smaller piece, enough to start again. He farmed it for 20 more years before his son took it over. His name was not in any newspaper in connection with any of this. He had simply been a man who tried, paid a price, and kept going. In the farming communities of the upper Midwest in the 1980s, that description fit more people than anyone counted. Back on the Brant farm, the years between 1985 and 1992 had their own texture, not the texture of triumph or recovery, but the texture of sustained effort in conditions that required it. The first year was the hardest, not because anything went catastrophically wrong, but because nothing went particularly right, and everything required more effort than it had before. The confidence that a farmer carries from operating on stable ground, the quiet assumption that if you do the work, the land will meet you halfway, had been shaken loose by the preceding years. Everett worked with a slight hesitation now, a beat of caution before decisions that he had once made automatically. Norma recognized it and did not comment on it directly. She simply worked beside him and let time do what time does. Grain prices stayed low through 1986. Everett had seen this coming and had spent the winter of 1985 talking to farmers in Iowa who had shifted their revenue mix and found a way through the commodity depression by diversifying. He expanded the hog barn in the spring of 1986. It was not a large expansion. He did not have the capital for large, but it was enough to add a revenue stream that was not entirely dependent on grain prices. Norma took a part-time job at a hardware store in Mapleton through the winters when fieldwork was not possible. She did not discuss it as a sacrifice or an inconvenience. She drove the 20 minutes each way and came home and made dinner and went over the farm accounts with Everett in the evenings, and they managed the numbers the way they managed everything together without drama, with the particular stubbornness of people who have decided they are not going to lose. Their son enrolled at the University of Minnesota in the fall of 1985. He was the first person in the Brandt family to attend a four-year university. He had chosen to study agricultural economics, a field he told his father later he had picked because he wanted to understand exactly what had happened to them in 1984 and why, and because he never wanted to be in a position of not understanding it again. Everett and Norma sat in the truck in the parking lot of his dormitory after they had helped him move his things in, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was not a way to say what the moment meant, that this was something the farm had made possible, that even now, even after everything the farm was still producing, what farms are supposed to produce, which is not only grain and livestock, but the kind of stability that lets a family reach toward a future. Their daughter was 16 that fall. She was quieter than her brother and watched more than she spoke and had a precision in how she said things that Everett recognized as Norma's. She drove tractor that autumn, the first harvest season, after the auction, working with a focus that did not require instruction or supervision. Everett watched her from the end of the field one afternoon, the machine moving in long, even rows, the girl at the wheel keeping the line straight without effort, and felt something he could not have named, precisely something in the range of gratitude, but larger than the word. Everett sent Clem a check in January of 1986. Not a large amount, the operation was still finding its footing, but something. He put a note in the envelope, a single line, "First of many, thank you." Clem wrote back on a half sheet of paper in his careful printing, "No rush, just keep going." That became the rhythm of the next several years. Everett would send what he could when he could. Clem would acknowledge it without pressure. No interest accumulated, no late fees, no letters from a bank. Around them, the agricultural crisis continued its work. The 1985 Farm Bill, which passed in December that year, included some debt restructuring provisions and created mediation requirements before foreclosures could proceed. It helped at the margins. It did not address the fundamental structure that had created the problem: the policy of encouraging farmers to leverage up against rising land values, the exposure of entire rural economies to the assumption that a single category of asset would appreciate indefinitely. Another 150,000 farms would be lost nationally between 1986 and 1989, even after the bill passed. Farms around the Brandt property changed hands. Some went to neighboring operations that absorbed the acreage, quietly adding it to existing footprints without fanfare. Some went to corporate buyers who ran them as managed investments, hiring labor to work ground that had been family-operated for generations. A few went to young farmers who had liquid capital from outside agriculture and saw an opportunity in the collapse. The landscape did not change visually. The fields were still flat and productive. The lines of trees along fence rows were still there. But the names on the mailboxes changed, and in farming country, the name on the mailbox carries a specific weight, a record of continuity that once broken does not easily reassemble. The first consolidated bank of Blue Earth did not survive to see the recovery it had bet on. In the spring of 1987, the bank was absorbed into a larger regional financial institution following the collapse of its agricultural loan portfolio. The building in downtown Blue Earth that had housed a banking operation since 1923 went through two commercial tenants in 18 months and then became a thrift store. The loan officers who had pushed expansion in the late 1970s and called loans in the mid-1980s moved to other banks in other towns without meaningful professional consequence. Capital is mobile. It does not carry the same accountability that land does. Philip Garrett, the loan officer who had sat at Everett's kitchen table in 1979 and told him he was leaving Equity idle retired in 1991. He moved to a lake community outside Brainerd. He did not think often about the Brandt farm or any of the farms he had helped to expand and then contracted on. The asymmetry of foreclosure is not only financial, it is also memorial. The person who loses carries the event forever. The institution that takes moves on to the next transaction. On a warm evening in June of 1992, Everett Brandt drove to the Vosburg farm and parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before he went to the door. He had been to this house many times over the 7 years since the auction for the kind of conversation that farming neighbors have: equipment, weather markets, the small, continuous negotiation of rural adjacency. But this visit was different, and he had known for 3 days that it was coming, and he had felt in the days leading up to it something he could not quite categorize. Not anxiety, more like the feeling before something significant is completed, the particular weight of a thing that has been open a long time preparing to close. Clem came to the door and looked at him. Everett held out an envelope. "Last one," he said. Clem took it. He did not open it at the door. He stepped back and said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Betty brought coffee without being asked and sat down with them. Clem opened the envelope and looked at the cashier's check inside: $87,000, the final installment of a debt that had been repaid over 7 years in amounts that ranged from several thousand to several tens of thousands, depending on what the year had allowed. "We're square," Everett said. Clem looked at the check for a moment. Then he looked at Everett. "We were always square," he said, "but I'm glad to have this." Everett had a question he had been carrying for the full 7 years, and he asked it now in Clem's kitchen with the coffee in front of him and Bet sitting across the table, because this was the moment for it if there ever was one. "What did it cost you? Really? What did carrying my debt for 7 years cost you?" Clem was quiet long enough that Everett thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Couldn't expand when expansion made sense. Ground came up to the north in 88 good acreage at a fair price. After the recovery started, went to someone else. Drove the same truck until it was embarrassing." He glanced at Bet. "The kitchen waited 9 years. Bet smiled very slightly, the smile of a woman who has long since made peace with something. "It was worth the wait," she said, which was true in more than one sense. "I'm sorry," Everett said, "that I put that weight on you." "You didn't put it on me," Clem said. "I picked it up. There's a difference." Everett looked at him for a moment. The light in the kitchen was the particular thick gold of a June evening in southern Minnesota, the kind that seems to slow time slightly, that makes the ordinary surfaces of a room look like something in a painting. "Why Barthka?" Everett asked. He meant it as a larger question than it appeared, not just why the auction, but why any of it. Why a man builds 4 years of careful saving and strategic patience toward a moment that has no direct benefit for him. Why a man who watched his father break on the same kind of reef chooses to stand in the way of it for someone else. Clem thought about it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. "My father worked 17 years in a plant in Albert Lea," he said. "He did the go, and he didn't complain, and he raised his family, and he died in the same rented house he moved into when they took the farm. And I watched him the whole time. I watched what it did to him. Not the loss of the land by itself, the loss of the thing the land was." He paused. "The loss of being a man who farms his own ground." He set the check down on the table and looked at it. "I stood at his grave and I told him I would not let that happen to someone else if I could stop it. I meant it then. I mean it now." He looked up at Everett. "You would have done the same. You know that." Everett thought about whether that was true and decided that he wanted it to be true, and that wanting it strongly enough was probably sufficient. "Maybe," he said. "You would," Clem said. The certainty in his voice was not the certainty of flattery, but of a man who had spent years observing what other men did under pressure and had formed a reliable opinion. They sat for a while after that without the need to say anything further. Outside the kitchen window, the June light was slowly deepening toward the color that comes just before dusk in the upper Midwest, a blue that has nothing melancholy in it but everything still. The fields to the north of the house were thick with early corn, the rows running with the evenness that only comes from good soil and careful work, green and ordered and going on beyond the fence line to where the sky came down and met them. The Brandt farm 6 miles south was also in corn. Both of Everett's kids had helped plant it that spring, the son home from his job in the cities for a week, the daughter driving tractor for the first time without Everett in the cab beside her, getting the row straight on her own. The farm was not only still standing, it was producing something. Elsewhere in the region in Martin County, Harlan DeWitt was in his 3rd year of working down the debt he owed Clem from the 1987 auction. He had 5 more years to go. He was making it. He would make it. He was a careful, deliberate man, and he had decided he was going to make it. And that decision in farming, as in most things, counts for more than the math alone. Everett drove home from the Vosburg farm in the morning June evening with the window down and the warm air coming through and the fields going past on both sides of the county road. He drove slowly. He was not in a hurry to be anywhere. He turned into his own driveway and parked and sat for a moment before he went inside. The aluminum storm door hung slightly crooked in its frame as it always had, as it probably always would. Norma had left the kitchen light on. Through the window, he could see the edge of the table, the surface she had refinished in 1969 over 3 weekends while he was in the field. Still there. All of it still there. He got out of the truck and went inside. The debt was paid. The farm was his. And the man who had made that possible was sitting 6 miles north with a cashier's check and a cup of coffee, already thinking about something else entirely, already moving on to whatever came next, already done with the part that required him to be recognized for what he had done. The June night came down full and quiet over Faribault County. In the dark, the fields on both sides of the county road were invisible, existing only as a particular quality of the air, thick with the specific smell of growing corn in early summer, the dense vegetable richness of a field in full growth. The kind of smell that means something specific to the people who know it. The kind of smell that belongs to a life lived in one place over time. The Brandt farm was dark and still and entirely irreversibly his. The years after 1992 moved differently. Not faster, not slower, differently. The particular quality of time that settles over a life when the acute emergency is over and the ordinary reasserts itself. Mornings that began with coffee and the farm report on the radio instead of the cold arithmetic of debt service. Seasons that could be experienced as seasons, again, the specific character of a Minnesota March, a June evening, an October afternoon when the harvest was coming in clean, rather than as intervals between financial threats. Everett noticed it gradually the way you notice a sound stopping rather than starting. One morning in the summer of 1993, he was standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, and he realized that he had been there for several minutes, simply looking at the fields without calculating anything. Not estimating yield or projecting prices or running the silent numbers that had occupied the back of his mind every morning for the better part of a decade. Just looking at the ground the way a man looks at something that belongs to him and his well. Norma noticed it too. She mentioned it sideways one evening over dinner by saying that he seemed like himself again. He knew what she meant, and she knew he knew, and that was enough between them. The operation continued to change shape through the 1990s, the way farming operations do when they have survived something and are finding their footing in what came after. The hog expansion from 1986 had proven its value through the years of low grain prices and continued to anchor a portion of the revenue. The corn and soybean rotations went back to their ordinary rhythm dependent on weather, and markets the way they had always been, no more or less uncertain than farming had ever been, which is to say considerably, but within the range of the manageable. Their son came back to the farm in 1994. Not immediately after his 1989 graduation, not in the flush of obligation, but after 5 years working at a farm credit cooperative in Minneapolis, where he had learned the financial architecture of agricultural lending from the inside, from the lender's side of the table, which was where the decisions that affected farmers were actually made. He came back with specific knowledge and a clear-eyed understanding of how to structure debt in ways that left room for the unexpected. He was 28 years old, and he had chosen deliberately and without pressure from Everett to come home to the ground where he had grown up. He and Everett worked the operation together for more than a decade through the commodity price swings of the late 1990s and the consolidation pressures that characterized the early 2000s through drought years and wet years and a hailstorm in July of 2001 that destroyed 40% of the corn crop on the South Field in 45 minutes on an afternoon that had begun clear and ordinary. They managed it. They were still there in the morning. That was what mattered. Everett's daughter studied nursing, completed her training in 1991, and took a position at a hospital in Rochester where she worked for 30 years. She came home for holidays and for harvest and for the particular occasions that pull families back toward their center of gravity. She brought her children to the farm every summer, children who grew up knowing the smell of the soil and the sound of the grain dryer running at night and the particular quality of the August heat in a Minnesota field at midday. They knew these things because the farm was still there to be known. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything a farm is for beyond the feeding of people. Harlan DeWitt made his final payment to Clem in February of 1995 on a cold morning at the Vossberg kitchen table, 8 years after the Martin County auction. He and Ruth had worked their operation the same way Everett and Norma had worked theirs methodically, without drama cutting where they could cut and earning where they could earn, sending Clem whatever the year allowed, and not making promises about amounts they might not keep. When Harlan set the final check on the table and Clem looked at it, there was a long silence of the kind that accumulates between men who have been through something together and have no need to narrate what it was. "I heard about what you did for the Brandt place," Harlan said. "Before you did it for me." Clem said nothing. "You saved 2 farms," Harlan said. Clem picked up the check and looked at it. "More than that," he said. "The 4 from the committee work, and a few others over the years different ways." He paused. "Small things." Harlan looked at him. "You never talked about it." "No reason to," Clem said. This was true in a way that was not modesty, but something more fundamental, a man who had decided early what kind of person he was going to be, and had simply been that person without the need for the being to be witnessed or acknowledged or translated into a narrative that made him look a certain way. The action was the thing. The accounting of the action was beside the point. Bate refilled the coffee cups and sat down, and the 3 of them talked for a while about the spring planting season and the price outlook and a piece of equipment that had been giving trouble all winter. The conversation of people who live close to the ground and whose primary reality is always the next season and what it will require. When Harlan left, he shook Clem's hand at the door for a long moment. Men of that generation and that region do not embrace easily. The handshake held everything that would have been in the embrace if either of them had been a different kind of man. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Clem continued farming. He was not a wealthy man. The years of carrying other people's debt had foreclosed certain opportunities. The Olson ground he had wanted in 1988 that went to a corporate buyer, equipment upgrades that would have made certain work easier. Modest expansions that would have been sensible at the right moments. His operation was solid but not large. He worked it with bet and occasional hired help, and the particular contentment of a man who knows exactly what his life is for and is living it accordingly. He gave an interview in 1989 to a reporter from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune who was writing a retrospective on the farm crisis for the 4th anniversary of Farm Aid. The reporter asked about the chronology, the motivations, the financial details, the outcome. Clem answered accurately and without embellishment. Near the end of the interview, the reporter asked whether he would do it again, knowing what it had cost him. Clem looked at the reporter for a moment. "Every time," he said, "every single time." The reporter asked why. "Because the alternative is living in a world where we all just watch each other drown," Clem said, "and I don't want to live there." The article ran on page B7 of the Sunday edition below the fold. Most people in Faribault County never saw it. Most people who did see it had already heard the story through the network of conversation that had been carrying it since 1985. The story was better in the telling than in print anyway, because the telling carried the specific texture of the barnyard and the wheel in the white envelope, which newspaper prose tends to flatten into something merely informational. Clem read the article, once noted that the reporter had gotten the details right and used it to start the kindling in the wood stove the following morning. Beatty retrieved it from the kindling pile before the fire caught and put it in a shoebox in the back of the closet where she kept things she was not ready to let go. She did not tell Clem. She kept it there for 30 years. The thing about Clem Vossberg that the people who knew him well understood, and that those who only knew his story sometimes missed, was that what he had done was not exceptional to him. It was not a departure from ordinary life or a moment of unusual moral clarity that stood apart from everything else. It was simply what the situation had required, and he had been positioned to meet the requirement, and so he had met it. The exceptionalism was in the preparation, the 4 years of deliberate saving, the trip to Rochester, the careful construction of a capacity that most people would not have thought to build. The action itself, when the moment came, felt to him like the natural consequence of a decision already made long before. This distinction mattered to him, though he never articulated it directly. It was the difference between a man who acts heroically in a crisis and a man who arranges his life so that heroic action is available to him when it is needed. Clem had done the second thing. He had looked at what was coming, and the farm crisis was visible to anyone paying attention as early as 1981, and he had asked himself what a person in his position could do about it, and he had done that thing quietly and over time before the specific moment of need had even arrived. He never spoke about this process of preparation to anyone, including Bet. It would have sounded like self-congratulation. It was not that. It was simply how he thought about problems practically with a horizon long enough to matter. The winters of the 2000s brought their own changes to the Vosburg farm, gradual at first, and then less so. Clem's body, which had been reliable for more than 6 decades, began to register the accumulated cost of what it had been asked to do. His hands, which had always been his most telling feature, broad calloused, permanently darkened in the creases, from 50 years of field work, began in his early 70s to carry a stiffness in the mornings that took longer each year to work out. He did not complain about this. He adjusted his schedule to accommodate it and continued. The winter of 2018 was the last winter he moved through without the kind of limitation that announces itself as a change in kind rather than degree. He was 75. He had been farming this specific ground for more than half a century. His body was telling him something he was not entirely ready to hear, and he dealt with this the way he dealt with most things, by acknowledging it practically and attending to what needed attending to. In the spring of 2019, he told Betty it was time to step back from the heavy field work. It was his way of saying what he could not quite bring himself to say directly. She understood it the way she understood most things he said, by hearing the sentence beneath the sentence. They arranged for a neighboring operation that had been working adjacent ground for 20 years to take on the Vosburg acreage. The family would keep the house and the home acres. They would stay in Faribault County, where Clem had been born, where his grandfather had broken ground a century earlier, where everything that had defined his adult life had taken place. This felt right to both of them without needing to be discussed. Clem died in October of 2019. He was 76 years old. He died in the bedroom of the farmhouse he had lived in his entire adult life, with Bet beside him on a morning when the maple in the front yard had turned the particular orange-red of a Minnesota October that is so saturated it looks painted rather than natural. The light through the window was the color of the season at its peak. He had not been ill in the dramatic sense, no catastrophic event, no sudden failure, but the accumulated weight of years and the quiet deterioration that accumulates in a body that has worked hard for a very long time. He had known for several months that the end was closer than it had been, and he had conducted himself accordingly, attending to what needed attending to, letting the rest go, not requiring the dying to mean more than the living had meant. He did not speak in those last months about the Brandt farm or the Martin County auction or the Fair Price Committee or any of the actions that would come to define how other people remembered him. He talked about the condition of the soil in the Southfield, which worried him after 2 wet springs. He talked about whether the neighboring operation taking on his acreage would manage the tile drainage properly. He talked about a history of the Dust Bowl he was reading, which he found himself returning to with the interest of a man who recognizes something in it. He died as he had lived, without requiring the life to carry more weight than it carried in the living of it. The funeral was held on a Thursday in late October at the Lutheran Church in Blue Earth, where the Vosburg family had worshipped since before Clem was born. His family had expected 100 people, perhaps a few more given that Clem was known in the county. The church held 300. By the time the service began, people were standing along the walls and in the entrance hall and outside the door in the October cold, listening through an open window to what was being said inside. They had come from 3 states. Farmers from Iowa who had heard the story through the network that connects agricultural communities across the upper Midwest at the level of feed stores and equipment dealers and county extension offices, the same network through which news of the Brandt auction had traveled in 1985. Farmers from Wisconsin and South Dakota who knew men who had been in Faribault County on March 14, 1985. Veterans of the farm crisis from across the region who carried their own versions of the story, not Clem's version, but adjacent ones, stories of people who had stood up in small ways when the system was grinding people down, people whose names were not on any official record, but who were held in the specific memory of the communities where they had acted. Everett Brandt was 75 years old, and he walked to the front of that church with the careful gait of a man his age who has decided he is not going to let his age show more than necessary. He stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled faces and took a breath and told the story of the auction. He told it the way he had told it many times over the years, at farm meetings, at family gatherings, to the occasional journalist or student researching the crisis, but he told it now with the full weight of 34 years behind it. Every specific detail intact: the temperature, the number of people in the barnyard, the sound, the auctioneer's voice made in the frozen air, the moment Clem's hand went up and every head turned, the bankmen walking to their car, the white envelope, the handwriting. He told them what was in the letter, and he saw people in the pews who had not known the exact words react to the simplicity of it, the complete absence of conditions, the pay me when you can pay me. That was not a transaction, but a different kind of thing, entirely a thing that did not have a good financial word for it. His voice held through most of it. Near the end, when he described sitting on the front porch step reading the letter for the third time, it did not hold entirely. He let it show. He was 75 years old and Clem Vosberg was dead, and there was no reason to hold it back. When Everett sat down, the church was still. Then Harlan DeWitt stood up. Harlan was 78 years old and walked with a cane he had started using 3 years ago and never quite reconciled himself to. He made his way to the front of the church slowly and stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled faces and began to speak. He told them about 1987. He told them about the letter he had received from his bank in November of that year, which was structured word for word like the letter Everett had received 3 years earlier. He told them about calling Clem on a Tuesday evening, and the single question Clem had asked, not "can you get through this," or "have you talked to a lawyer," or "what are your options," but "what is the auction date?" He told them about standing at his kitchen window on a gray November morning, watching Clem's truck pull into his driveway unannounced. He told them about the white envelope. The church became still in the way that a space full of 300 people can occasionally become still, a collective attention with the quality of held breath. Everett, sitting in the front pew, had turned when Harlan began speaking. He had heard the year 1987. He had understood what was coming, and he felt something shift in his chest that was entirely new. Something that had no name yet, because he had not known this moment was possible. He had not known. In 34 years, through all the conversations at kitchen tables and over fence lines and at the grain elevator, and at every occasion where he and Clem had been in the same room, Clem had never mentioned it. Not once, not a reference, not an implication, not the sideways acknowledgement of a man who wants credit without appearing to want it. Nothing. The Martin County auction had lived in Harlan's memory, and in Clem's memory, and in Bet's memory, and in Ruth DeWitt's memory, and nowhere else for 32 years until this moment in a Lutheran church in Blue Earth on a Thursday afternoon in October. Clem had sat across from Everett at the kitchen table in June of 1992 and answered the question of why he had done what he had done. He had talked about his father and the grave and the promise and what the land meant. He had said all of it truthfully. And he had not once in that conversation or in any conversation before or after it mentioned that he had done the same thing again 2 years later for a different man in a different county. It had simply not come up because Clem had not brought it up, because Clem did not bring things up that he had done. Everett sat in the front pew of that church and looked at the floor and felt the full weight of what that silence had contained. After the service, the crowd moved outside into the October afternoon and did not immediately disperse the way people linger after something that has not fully finished resolving itself in its ending. Conversations moved through the group, not the usual funeral small talk, but something more specific, people sharing their own pieces of the story, the things they had witnessed or heard or been connected to through the network of the preceding 30 years. Everett found Bet near the door of the church. She was receiving people with the composed exhaustion of a woman who has been in this posture for hours and will be in it for hours more. When she saw Everett, she took his hand and held it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't know," Everett said. "About Harlan. In 34 years, he never told me. Not once." Bet nodded. "He wouldn't have. You know that." Why not even mention it just once?" She thought about how to say it, not because she did not know the answer. She had known Clem for 40 years, and she knew the answer the way she knew most things about him, completely and without effort. She was thinking about how to translate it into language that would be understood by someone who had not been married to him. "He saw a problem," she said finally. "He fixed what he could fix. He didn't need a record of it." She paused. He would have found it embarrassing, honestly, if people had made too much of it. The doing was enough for him. The knowing that it had been done. Everett looked at her for a moment. He said to me once, Everett said that we were always square from the beginning, that the money was just a formality. That was true for him, Bet said. He believed that being neighbors meant you were already in each other's debt in ways that couldn't be added up. The money was just one expression of something that was always there. The October afternoon did what October afternoons do in southern Minnesota, the light coming down at the angle that makes everything look simultaneously more and less real than it is the maples in the churchyard at their deepest color, the sky above them a blue so clear it seems almost solid. A farm truck was parked along the road with a bumper sticker from an agricultural advocacy organization that had been prominent during the crisis years. The sticker was faded, the colors bleached by a long succession of summers, but the words were still legible. A farmer from Iowa was standing beside the truck reading it. He had not known Clem personally. He had known the story the way you know the story of someone who did something in your community that mattered as part of the record of what the community was capable of at its best. In the weeks after the funeral, Everett thought often about what Betty had said. He turned it over the way you turn something smooth in your hand, not to analyze it, but to feel its shape. He saw a problem. He fixed what he could fix. It was not complicated as a philosophy. It did not require a framework or a theory or a system of belief beyond the basic recognition that other people's problems are real and that if you have the capacity to address them, you have some obligation to try. Clem had arrived at this through watching his father spend 17 years in a meatpacking plant who should have spent them farming. He had taken that grief and made it functional rather than static. He had asked himself what the lesson was, and he had arrived at an answer, and he had built his life around the answer without ever needing to announce what he was doing. The Brandt farm in the fall of 2019 looked different from the Brandt farm of 1985 in the ways that 34 years of continuous operation change a piece of ground and the buildings that sit on it. The old equipment shed had been replaced with a larger structure in 1998. The cattle barn had been converted to equipment storage when the hog operation was restructured in the early 2000s. The cottonwoods along the north fence that Everett's father had planted in 1955 were enormous now, their trunks wider than a man's reach, their canopy in summer casting a line of shade along the fence that could be seen from the county road. Everett's son ran most of the operation. He was 53 years old, exactly 2 years older than Everett had been on the morning of the auction in 1985. Everett had noted this coincidence privately, and with a particular quality of feeling, he could not name exactly something about time and repetition and the way a life circles back toward the moments that made it. Everett still walked the fields when the season allowed, not to assess or calculate, but simply to walk them the way he had walked them on that last night before the auction because they were his and he was not going to be somewhere else when it mattered to be present. He walked more slowly now. He noticed different things. The soil had the quality that comes from decades of careful stewardship, dark friable, the kind that crumbles the right way in your hand, that carries in its texture a record of how it has been tended. On these walks, he thought about Clem. Not with elegy. Everett was not a man given to elegy, but concretely. He thought about what a different set of events would have looked like. The world in which Clem had stayed home on March 14, 1985, which would have been the rational choice, the financially prudent choice, the choice that would have cost Clem nothing and that no one would have criticized him for making. In that world, the Brandt farm passed to the bank and then to an investor and then to whatever corporate structure eventually absorbed it. Everett and Norma found somewhere else to live and something else to do. Their son did not go to the University of Minnesota to study agricultural economics. Their daughter did not bring her children to the farm every summer. The Brandt name on the mailbox on that county road ended in March of 1985 instead of passing into its fourth generation. None of this was dramatic as a thought. It was simply true. What Clem had done was small in the sense that it had affected a small number of people. It did not change policy or restructure the agricultural credit system or address the fundamental failures that had created the crisis. 200,000 farms were lost nationally between 1985 and 1990. Clem Vosberg could not affect that number. He could only affect the specific farms within his reach, and he had done that, and the farms were still there, and the families were still there, and the children and grandchildren of those families were living the particular lives that continuity makes possible. Farmland in Minnesota in 2019 averaged between $5,000 and $6,000 per acre in prime agricultural counties. Young farmers attempting to enter the industry faced debt loads that expressed as a ratio of income to debt service resembled the debt loads of 1981 in their essential structure. The same fundamental problem, asset prices inflated beyond what agricultural income could sustainably service over a full commodity cycle, was being reproduced in the conditions of a different era with different specific numbers and different specific lenders, but the same underlying architecture of risk. When the next crisis came, and it would come because these cycles have a regularity that is not mysterious once you have lived through one, the question would be the same question it had always been. Whether there were people in the affected communities who had the capacity and the will to stand up at the moment when standing up was possible. Whether there were people who had been building something for years quietly without announcement, waiting for when someone needed it. Whether there were people like Clem Vosberg. One afternoon in November, a month after the funeral, Everett drove out to the Vosberg farm to check on Bet. She was managing the way she had always managed, things practically attending to what needed attending, to not requiring the managing to be witnessed. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so many of the important things of the preceding decades had been decided, and drank coffee and talked about the winter coming and the condition of the ground and the neighboring operation now working the Vosberg acreage. Before Everett left, Bet went to the back of the house and came back with a small shoebox. Inside was a folded piece of newspaper, slightly yellowed, the print still legible. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune, 1989. Clem's face in a photograph, younger looking, slightly off camera, with the expression of a man who has agreed to have his picture taken and finds the process mildly embarrassing. He used it to start the wood stove, Bates said. I took it out before it caught. I kept it for 30 years. She held it out to Everett. He would have burned it eventually. But I thought you should have it. Everett took the folded paper and held it for a moment. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the headline, modest in the typeface of a B-section story the editors had not judged important. Faribault County farmer helped neighbor keep land during 85 crisis. Thank you, he said. He drove home on the county road in the late November afternoon, the fields on both sides bare and dark after harvest. The sky, the particular pewter gray of a Minnesota November that carries no drama, but all the weight of a season moving toward its ending. He turned into his driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The farm was quiet the way a farm is quiet after harvest, fully itself resting in its own continuity, holding in the frozen soil the record of everything grown there and the preparation for everything that would grow there again. The aluminum storm door hung slightly crooked in its frame, as it had always hung, as it probably always would. He thought about his son inside the house, who had spent 30 years learning the financial architecture of the thing that had nearly been taken from them and had come back to work it, and was now teaching his own son what the soil required and what the seasons meant. He thought about his daughter's children running the fence lines in August, learning the particular heat of a Minnesota field at midday, learning the smell of the turned soil in spring, and the sound of the grain dryer at night. He thought about the 4 farms the committee had saved and the choices those farms had enabled for the families on them, the children raised there, the futures made possible, the quiet accumulation of lives lived in continuity with the ground they occupied. He thought about Clem Vosberg's truck pulling into Harlan DeWitt's driveway in Martin County in November of 1987, alone, unannounced, carrying a white envelope that nobody outside that county would know about for 32 years. The November dark came down full and early over Faribault County, the way it does in the upper Midwest. Not gradually but decisively, the light failing all at once in the last quarter hour, until the fields are simply dark and the lights in farmhouse windows are the only warm things in the landscape. Everett got out of his truck and went inside. The kitchen light was on. The table Norma had refinished in 1969 was still there, its surface worn smooth in the places where hands had rested for half a century of meals and conversations and evenings. The coffee was hot. Outside the window, the fields that his father had farmed, and he had farmed, and his son was farming, stretched out into the dark, quiet and patient, and waiting for spring, as they had always waited, as they would always wait. Some things survive, not because they are powerful, not because they are protected by systems built to protect them, not because the people who depend on them are exceptional or lucky or positioned differently from the people who lose. They survive because at a specific moment in a specific place, someone with the capacity to act decided to act and backed that decision with everything they had saved for exactly that purpose and did not need anyone to know about it afterward. That is not a small thing. It has never been a small thing. It is, in the end, how the things worth keeping get kept.